Hello friends, and welcome back to Random Hearts. Today we're going to share some video clips from some projects that we did over the month of August. And this is one of those projects. I am going to be removing all of the large bark in this section that I'm standing in. And I do need several tools to do this. From experience, I know I need some very thick gloves, some scissors, and I'm going to be using a kneeling pad and this pop-up bag to remove the bark. Now, this bark has been here since about 2016. And originally, we did not plan on having much in these garden beds. They were just going to be for trees and shrubs, but we have since changed our plans, and now we are wanting to remove this large bark. There are a few other reasons why we need to remove this, but we'll get into that as we get into this project. Now, this project right here took me several days, and I am going to speed up some of the footage on this even because this took several hours. But I am starting off with gloves here, and here in just a little bit, I'm going to resort to another tool. I used kind of an unconventional tool. I thought about using a shovel here, but I did not want to lose all of the nice humus and broke down bark that was underneath all this large bark. And I end up using what we use for picking up leaves. They're a handheld leaf rake, and it seemed to be the easiest and best way to handle all of the bark. And here in just a few minutes, I will grab that. I also eventually give up on the kneeling pad as I found it was just too cumbersome to move it every couple of inches, and it was kind of getting in my way more than it was helping me. So I really resorted to just getting myself dirty, having a sore knee and back, and just getting this project done. You'll see that I am leaving a layer of dirt here, and that is that humus layer. This is all the broke down wood chips that have happened over the last several years, and I want to keep that layer as much as possible. But here is the problem. Under that huge layer of humus and organic material there, we have got a weed barrier that is preventing the soil from taking in all of those nutrients. Now, when we put this in 2016, we may have been a little naive thinking that, oh yeah, this weed barrier will do the job, keep all the weeds out, and unfortunately, boy, were we wrong. In fact, the trees and the weeds have thrived in this layer of very nutrient-rich soil that sits on top of the weed barrier. So rather than send their roots down into the ground where the soil is not nutrient rich, they are actually sitting on top of that layer of weed barrier and trying to build roots there. We have actually gotten quite a few surface roots on some of our trees because of this problem. We're also getting a lot of weeds because they have such a deep, thick layer of nutrient soil to actually grow in. And for those of you that have been on the channel for a while, you know that we have issues with our elm tree self-seeding constantly. So we end up with a lot of elm tree sprouts during the year. By design, our retaining wall blocks have a void on the back side. That is so that you can curve them and turn them for different angles and rotations. But that did create problems for us with this bark because the bark would get wedged in those triangular areas, and the only way to get it out was to use my hands. So I did have to hand pull out everything underneath the blocks near the retaining wall. And then the other problem I had was some of my plant choices up here, for instance, this barberry, were not so fun to work around. If you've ever worked around a barberry, you know that it has lots of pokey little stickers, and this was getting me pretty well. I had a lot of trouble working around this plant. I did in the end get it, but it was not a pleasant experience. I also was having trouble with the sheer weight of the bark. We had not turned our sprinkler system off the night before, and we probably should have, because all of the wood in this area was sopping wet, and that made it very heavy and hard to transport. So I would definitely do some things differently. After I removed the majority of the large bark on the surface, I then started working on removing that weed barrier, and you can see how thick this is here. I am literally rolling it up like carpet, and I am sitting on a layer of very rich dirt underneath that roll, and I don't want to lose that. You can see underneath our native soil has a very little nutrient value, and none of that has been getting to that soil. And that is some of the reason I don't think weed barriers are a great idea, especially if you're going to be working with an organic material that will break down over time. Not a good way to go. And I think the only way I would ever use a weed barrier again is if I was putting down a gravel area and I wasn't planting anything in it, and I could keep up on any little weeds or sprouts that tried to come through as the layers of dirt built up. And they will build up. Over time, erosion and wind will bring in dirt and leave that sitting on top of that weed barrier. And you can see I had a lot of roots and surface roots that I had to go through here. This was just so thick, and the weed barrier was actually attached to the ground with the roots that were coming up through it, and it really was not doing its job at all. In fact, I would say it was probably a failure on almost every level. You can see how thick the layer of dirt that was on top of that and all the roots that were coming through it. Now this is what it looked like at the end of day one, and I'm just leveling it all out, making sure everything looks really good, and I've made sure that I've gotten all of the large bark off of here. I have no more fabric underneath any of this, and I'm just making sure I've got a nice level surface to work with. Then I'm going to be removing some rocks. We put in these river rocks between these areas right here to create some separation between the different types of bark. And this was temporary so that we could separate the areas of the yard between the flower beds and the different bark sizes. And now that everything is going to have the same size bark in the beds, we do not need to have any kind of separation. So I am going to remove all of these river rocks. We'll put them back over into the stockpile we have over by the garden beds, and those will be used in another project later on. Now I am ready to start replacing this bark, and we are going to be using a mini bark. This is a much finer bark than the stuff we had on previously, and I'll show you here in a minute what was on there and what we are replacing it with. There is quite a difference in size, but this is probably the most satisfying part of this project. And it's pretty much when everything starts coming together and it looks so much better. I ended up using, I believe, 6 bags of bark on this little area right here. And I just open up the bags and kind of swirl it around. It gets a little more difficult when you're working around trees and shrubs, but I find it easiest just to sit on my hands and knees and spread this around with my hands. I have used a rake, and you can see one in the background. But to get underneath all of these plants and to push everything up against the retaining blocks on our wall and our fence, I just found it easiest to get down and push it around by hand. Now, this does not give it the most level surface. There are a lot of bumps and lumps because of my knees, but in the end, I'm going to water this all in, and you'll see it actually looks really good, and I've got a pretty even surface. For those of you noticing that this bark is very red in tone, that will weather within a very short amount of time. You'll notice the stuff on the lower level, that was that same color, and within a month it will start graying. And this is the end result with it all watered in and leveled out. You can see I've got it all the way around all the plants. I took out all the rocks separating between flower beds and other bark layers. And of course, this opened a whole new can of worms. I noticed that some of these perennials in the flower bed needed a trim, so I did work on that as well. And then of course, you know, this is complete. It looks great, and I'm super happy with it. It'll also be a lot easier to plant in these sections, and I think we'll get a little more breakdown of the bark and hopefully amend our soil as the bark does break down. We are now on to another project. This is the flagstones that will go around our raised garden beds. And this area is definitely an area of concern Because our entire yard slopes this direction, and this is the east side of our yard, meaning that our prevailing winds that come from the west bring in and deposit a lot of snow here in the wintertime. We end up with a very muddy mess in the early spring months. And that makes it difficult to get into our garden beds. About 2 years ago, we decided, because we had some extra gravel, that we would lay that down in this area. And although that did help a little bit, you still would squish down into the gravel as you walked across this area. So we decided that we needed to purchase some flagstones. And these are a native flagstone, meaning they come from our area. They are a sandstone, which means they will break down over time, but they will look a little more natural in this area. And 2 years ago, we purchased some, we set them down, and that is all the further this project got until now. Last fall, we did purchase more flagstones because we knew we did not have enough, and you'll see here in a little bit, we actually still did not have enough. And the reason we couldn't purchase it all at once is because we just don't have a vehicle that's heavy enough to carry that much weight. These do weigh quite a lot. And because they've been sitting on the ground here for almost 2 years, they have soaked in and kind of made divots into the ground, and that is what my husband is doing here. He is leveling this area out as best as he can and getting rid of any imperfections and divots in the ground that may cause us problems with leveling out these flagstones. Now, when I say level out, I don't mean this is going to be a level surface. In fact, we still have to work with the slope that's in our yard to keep everything running and draining properly. So this will not be a flat area, but he is leveling it out so that we can have as flat of area as possible. And there will be imperfections in this, and we are definitely not doing it exactly by the books. In fact, we are not putting down the base that we probably should, but our soil here is very sandy to begin with. And like I said, once it gets wet, things just soak right into it, and your foot will fall into it, and so will these rocks. And as the flagstones weather and break down a little, they'll become part of this area. And that's what we're looking for. We want this to be as natural as possible without being too much work. And he's going to tamp this down now and make sure that everything is compacted as best as possible. Then he's going to start adding a layer of sand. Now, the two pieces of flagstone you see on the screen right in front of you, we knew that from laying those down in the last 2 years, those were a good fit for that area. The rest of it, not so much. And we are going to just be puzzle piecing these together and trying to figure out exactly what works best for the shape of this area and for the stepping patterns. And you'll see that we do have a couple of different color variations, and that is because we've picked this up at separate times, and they are quarrying these from different areas, so they will have different patterns and colors. So we are going to have to intermix that as well. The sand and gravel he is using are actually leftover materials from when we did our patio pavers over by the fire pit last year. And rather than discard those materials, we decided we would use them here. We know that this will probably add to the stability of these flagstones, but we don't think it's totally necessary, especially in our area, because of course, with 2 years experience of just laying these flat on the ground, we know that they're not going to move a whole lot, and there isn't going to be a problem with them staying where they need to be. The biggest problem we have with this area is that we have a hard time bringing garden hoses across it because they catch on the rough edges and the high spots on the stones. We also have problems with them being tripping hazards. So we just want to level these out and keep them as neatly and orderly as possible so that we can walk across them and bring a garden hose in without too much trouble. And once my husband got all of these into place and figured out where he wanted the large stones, the small stones, and the different colors and shapes, he is going to be adding in some gravel. And like I said, this gravel was from that leftover project, so nothing was going to waste here. In fact, we will probably have to buy a couple more bags of gravel in the end. But we did leave quite a bit of space between each flagstone, and that is because we are planning on putting some kind of a planting in between them. I had originally wanted to use some kind of creeping thyme between each of these flagstones, but in the end, I had a hard time finding something that I liked. I ended up with a different plant. I'm not even sure if it will work in the same way. I will get that planted here very soon so that it has time to root in, but I do have concerns with how much gravel it has to push through every spring when it does come up. So hopefully this will work out in the end. This is a huge improvement over what we have been dealing with in this area for the last 2 years, and my husband did a fantastic job of piecing all of these flagstones together and getting everything as level as possible. You'll also notice that we are missing some gravel in areas, and that is because we ran out. We also need to purchase some more flagstones, and hopefully we will get this project buttoned up and done before snow arrives. So we hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions or comments about what we have done on these 2 projects, please let us know in the comment section down below. And we hope you're having a lovely day wherever you are, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.